All right, so before we start coloring, let's talk about Copics a little bit. So Copic markers are an alcohol-based markers. The ones that I'm using in this class are Chow's. They also have Sketch and Original. Original has different tips to them, but the Sketch has the exact same tips as the Chow's. The only difference is the pen shape. The Chow's are a circle, and the Sketch have an oval shape to them so they don't roll on your surface, and they also hold a lot more ink. So these ones here have a chisel tip as well as a brush tip. For the most part, it's the brush tip that I typically use when I'm coloring. There's a few techniques and a few different things that I'll use the chisel tip for, but for general coloring, I don't really use the chisel tip. Now, the nice thing about the Copics is you can get refills to refill them. And typically, if I'm in the middle of coloring, oops, I will just drop ink on the different tips to suck it in so that I can continue coloring. If I'm not going to be coloring for a while, I will pull the chisel tip out and I will put some ink in the center. And if you look online, there's someone that has figured out exactly what the weight of each pen should be when they're full. That's an easy way to know how much ink, so you don't want to put too much in there. I typically will do 10 to 20 drops depending on how dry it is, and then if my tips are super dry, I'll also put some on the tips of the pen. Now, I only pull out the chisel tip because the brush tip, there's a little core in there, and sometimes, and this is a lot squishier. The chisel tip's a lot more dense, and sometimes if you pull on the brush tip, you'll just pull the outside part off of that core and you'll ruin your tip and you have to replace the tip. Now, speaking of replacing tips, the nice thing about Copics is that if you have a tip that goes bad, and the odd time that does, or breaks down, and if you do a lot of coloring, that's possible, you can get replacement tips for your pens. So you don't have to throw a pen away because the tip has gone funny or broken down or whatnot. They last a long time. They're really, really good quality, but sometimes it does happen. So it's really nice to know that you can refill the ink in the pens, and you can also replace the tips. So it makes it more economical. They're definitely more of an investment to start, but compared to dye-based markers, they will last a lot longer. And in the long run, they end up being more economical because you can refill them. Now, for stamping, and this refill here is an old style. They've redone the packaging, so the new ones are a little bit different. The refill inside is exactly the same. For stamping, if I'm just stamping and then coloring, I'll use Memento Tuxedo Black or whatever color. If you want to use a color, I typically will just do black. If you want to emboss your images, I like to use Brilliance Graphite Black and then clear powder. You have to use clear powder because the alcohol in the marker will start breaking down that embossing powder, and you don't notice it with the clear powder, but if you're using some colors, it can start to streak in your project. If you're wanting the embossing to look like color, you can use a color of Brilliance ink and then emboss it with the clear powder and get the same effect that way. But this is what I use for embossing with it. Now, speaking of pens, one of the pens that has a clear cap is called the Colorless Blender. This is not how you blend two Copic colors together. To blend two colors together, you take a light color, and we'll get more into it as we're coloring in images. You take the light color, you add some shadow with the dark color, and then you go back with the light color, and I use a circular motion right where that light and dark meet, and then use that light color over the whole thing. That is how you blend two colors together, and this is just quickly done, so it's not colored beautifully. To remove color, you're going to use the Colorless Blender. Now, I've got a darker red here. With the dark colors, it's not going to remove it completely, but it's going to fade it enough that it's not nearly as noticeable. So if you happen to color outside the line or whatnot, this is how you can help fix it. So for this, I definitely use the chisel tip on my marker, and you can see how that's changed the color there. So I will use my chisel tip to color it over the ink that has gone outside the lines or wherever you want to remove it. I will do that, let it dry completely, and you can tell when it's dry when the paper is completely dry. So I can see with the wetness of where the paper is wet still from the marker. You need to wait till it's completely dry, because if you keep doing it while it's wet, it's just going to make that area bigger and bigger. It's like it's almost like a thing of water. It'll just keep going out and out and out. And if you want to remove a color just in a certain area, you need to do this, let it completely dry. It's not totally dry, but I think it's dry enough that I can, and then you're going to do it again. And you can see how that's got less color than that there. So it does take some patience to fix an area that happens to have color that you don't want, but you can get it light enough so that it's not nearly as noticeable. Lighter colors you can pretty much remove totally. There may be just the odd little bit, but typically the person that notices most is the person that's doing the coloring or the creating. So just remember, the colorless blender doesn't blend, it removes color. So now that we've gone over those few basic things, I'll see you in the next video and we will start coloring an image.